Hi, I'm Imogen Wood. I'm the Senior National Consultant for Heritage and Climate at the National Trust for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I'm doing a presentation on our approach to climate change adaptation, particular focus on how we're engaging people in that approach. So the first thing at the National Trust we're finding is people are so caught up on the idea of mitigation that they really struggle with the concept of adaptation. And in my role, it's not just about trying to get people to understand climate change overall and all the climate science behind it. It's much more about trying to get them to relate to that through place and through things that they love. And so when we talk about mitigation, people can relate to that really easily because they understand that it's about turning off lights. They understand that it's about reducing their impact on the climate. And what we're trying to get people to do is think much more about how might the climate be impacting me. And so this way that we're approaching it is much more about trying to find language and ways of getting that message across to people to help them understand that there is already a path that we're on, and we need to start changing the way that we manage our places to help them adapt to those climate hazards in the future. So we've come up with this approach to hazard mapping, which is drawing together existing data to understand the National Trust's exposure to climate hazards. We've teamed up with UK regulators, so Historic England, Historic Environment Scotland, Department for Communities in Northern Ireland, and also Cadw in Wales, to try and look at the data that is actually available already to help us understand what's our level of risk, what's our level of exposure when it comes to these historic and beautiful places that we manage. And in doing that, we're also trying to adopt the ISO 14090 standard, which fits in with our own standard for environmental management. So this is basically the climate change adaptation standard for the UK. And it's trying to make sure that we have a methodology in place to understand our exposure, then look at what options are available to us and when should we make those changes, make sure we've got a baseline understanding, and then look at how we might monitor that in the future. And also, we've got 80,000 volunteers and 8,000 staff. It's trying to make sure all of those people understand that climate is a really big threat to our sites, and we need to make changes now in order to be able to deal with that. So I'll just take you through some of those steps. The first thing we needed to do was really understand what hazards are affecting us the most. And so we focused on these 6 to start with. So coastal processes, flooding, heat and humidity, storm damage, landslip, and shrink swell, or subsidence, and thinking about what those layers look like now in terms of the data, and what might they look like on the worst case scenario in, say, 40 years time. And that's where we get those maps. The one you see here is a heat and humidity map. So in order to get a red hexagrid, it has to be over 30 degrees C for at least 15 days of the year. So in the UK, that doesn't happen much at the moment, but in 2060, it might happen a lot more. And then it's looking at the assets that we actually manage. Gardens is obviously very relevant to this talk, and it's thinking what's actually vulnerable about those spaces. And we did a big literature review, and we looked at a lot of our sites and got case studies and evidence in our sort of living lab of charitable places. And it's trying to understand what's actually being impacted right now and how much worse could that get. And this picture was taken in April in the UK, and it's, this should be a green lawn, and that's kind of the key significance of this view, and it's already yellow. So what do we start doing about that in the future, and how sustainable is it to keep that irrigation going when that water is going to have more and more pressure and demand put upon it? And then what's actually impacted? Is it people? Is it something tangible about that place that makes it significant? And if it doesn't matter, we don't necessarily need to adapt as much as we think we do. So a lot of our sites suffer from flooding, and yes, we might need to then change the surfaces of those paths, but it might be just a matter of maintenance. So it's just making sure that we understand how badly something's actually impacted by those events, and then making appropriate change. So that, how do we adapt to those climate hazards? It's resisting or accepting or directing that change. And it's understanding as well that you don't just jump to the end point and just say, okay, well, that lake's drying out every year now, so let's just fill it in. There's lots of steps you can take along the way to help adapt to those climate hazards, such as drought, which might not be that really sort of screeching turnaround in how you're managing in terms of conservation. So we know that, well, we know that we don't know what's going to happen, but the philosophy with using the 8.5 RCP, the representative concentration pathway, is that we're planning for the worst. We think this is the worst it's going to get, but obviously we recognise that we might not get there. So it's just making sure we've got those plans in place, and then hopefully we can get to a point where, where it's always reversible, and we can come back from this if we, if we follow that best plan, but understand that things might go wrong, then we've got that uncertainty under control. But also it's not how do we adapt all of our assets. And we've got 28,000 buildings. We've got about 800 miles of coastline, and there's a lot of stuff along the coast in the UK. So it's not so much about how do we adapt everything. We have to be able to learn to cope with loss. And we have to be able to shift the culture that people have got used to in terms of conservation, which is almost a preservationist approach. So some sites, yes, we might be able to move them away from the edge of coast. Yes, we might be able to adapt them to flooding and change varieties in our gardens. But some sites we're going to have to lose over time. And that's quite a big thing to have to change the culture around preservation to deal with. We're working with the International National Trust Organisation, and we've secured some funding from the British Council to be able to look at withstanding change, heritage amongst climate uncertainty, with 6 other countries in the Near East and in Africa, looking at how can we look at their hard adaptation measures across those countries and think about twinning those with some of our places to make it connect with people in the UK that this is really bad, where these people are having to make really big changes to their sites to manage the heritage there, but it is already quite bad at some of our sites. And so we're trying to get that hook by twinning with these international sites and think about ways of engaging people with the places that they connect with and love, and thinking about what those futures might look like through interpretation. And so we've already done previously at Quarry Bank Mill, which is near Manchester. This is actually our biggest electricity user in the whole of all of our sites. And it's, one of the sort of key sites for the Industrial Revolution, and it's got a lot of history associated with that turn in the way that people manage place and use energy. And it's the sort of unintended consequences of that which have led us to where we are, as a society. And so this exhibition was all about engaging people with that journey, with that story. And what we want to do is another 6 projects like that, twinning to those African and Near East countries. We also did some work in Northern Ireland to look at coastal swell and flooding, and looking at how much that can actually impact a site in the future, and not just the building and the gardens, but also actually the access to the site. And the principal access to this beautiful garden is along Strangford Lough. So if that access isn't there in the future, how do we get people to these sites? How do we get people to engage with their places if their places are no longer accessible in the same way? And just lastly as well, we've been working on this adaptation guidance. So this is thinking about what are the thresholds for change, what are the actual options that we could undertake, and that's available at that link there via the International National Trusts Organisation website. And there's lots of information on there. We've got 3 sections at the moment about to come out on gardens, looking at grass and turf, historic design parkland, and living collections as well will soon be on there. At the moment, we've got some on infrastructure and paths, and we've also got some information on there on archaeological sites, other aspects of these historic and beautiful places, such as the ones that the National Trust manages. And if I just click on this, hopefully it will open and I'll be able to show you. So this is hosted on the International National Trusts Organisation website. And we're really grateful for their help in putting this on a platform where we can actually get it across to international audiences. There's a section on how to understand the different types of guidance, but they all follow the same format. So we've got basically 6 or 7 pages that tell you essentially what it is that you're looking at, what type of asset, why it matters in the face of climate, some hazards and impacts and options tables for those different asset types, and then pathways for change and case studies. So I'll just scroll down and show you. There's also a hazard map on there. So if you wanted to look at it's only UK data, but that information's on there as well. So these are the chapters. We can see we've got things like people and visitor activity. So it's not just assets, but it's also the activity we have at the National Trust that we manage. And there is a section that's coming out on gardens. So we've got parks and lawns and turf and living collections, which will be coming out later this year. We're hoping to launch those ahead of COP28. At the moment, we've got a link to the Natural England Climate Change Adaptation Guidance, which follows a very similar format, and that has things like wood pasture and parkland, and different habitats and different species on there. But if I just open up a section, say on water, we've got one for water features in gardens. And as I say, they all follow the same sort of format. So, excuse me. So there's an introduction to what that asset type is. There's why it matters in the face of climate change and what we might want to do about it in order to conserve it. Those hazards and options, so the hazards that we've identified that may impact that particular asset type, the different impacts that might be experienced, and the options that you might then look to undertake in order to help you with that conservation purpose. We've gone into more detail about those options and also thought about practical management thresholds and tipping points. So this isn't climate data thresholds, it's more about recognizing on the ground when is enough in how we're trying to conserve or preserve something, and when might we want to make that change onto a different pathway of conservation approach. And so there's an example using the dynamic adaptive policy pathways, which is something that the University of Reading, the Walker Institute was looking at, and the original references there, if people wanted to look them up, the original paper for the DAP. But this is just a tool to help people understand that it's not about just going straight from one approach that's not working to the worst possible or end approach. It's recognizing that there's lots of steps you could do along the way that you may be able to undertake to help you adapt, and that may be reversible as well. And then we've got case studies from across the UK as well on where we're experiencing issues with that particular asset type already, and how they may have already been approached in terms of adapting to climate hazards. There's also some signposting for each one as well. So as I say, we've got several sections already on there, several on archaeology and landscape. We're working on ones for collections and internal fabric. There's one at the moment for paths on infrastructure, one at the moment for rainwater goods on buildings. And we wanted to release these iteratively because they take a long time to produce. So it's about trying to share as much information as possible to try and help other people who've got similar sorts of sites that they're trying to look after. So I hope that's useful and a quick run through of what we've been working on here at the National Trust. If anyone wanted to get in touch, I'd be really happy. If you just want to email me, I am off actually on maternity leave in about 4 weeks' time, but I'm really happy to respond to anything in the meantime. Thank you.